No skip albums. Albums you can listen to without skipping a single track. Albums that if you have a copy of on vinyl, you can sit and listen to the entire thing in a period of sonic bliss. Today, I'm talking about my favorite no skip albums from one of the most legendary decades in music, and that's the 70s, but only the first half. I'm Ryan. I talk music. Let's get it. In my first episode, I tackled no-skip albums from the 1960s. That's a decade where music output was a little bit more limited. It was a time where modern music was honestly kind of finding its foundation. In the 70s, things greatly expanded forward as rock and jazz music, they took major steps forward, and there started to be a number of offshoots in these genres, especially rock. So since the 70s were so broad, this is getting split into two videos, one for the first half and one for the second half of the 70s. This video tackles 1970 through 1974. As a refresher, the only rule I have is one album per artist per video. So for instance, I could pick only one Beatles album from the 60s, I can only pick one Black Sabbath album from the first half of the 70s. Make sense? So big names show up here in the first half of the 70s, so let's not waste any more time, shall we? I'm going to start off with one that's a heavy hitter, and this is a pretty obvious no-skipper. It's Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon from 1973. It's widely celebrated as one of the greatest albums of all time. It's also one of the best-selling albums of all time. And this is a rare situation where an album is considered one of the greats, it's sold more than most other albums, and it lives up to all the hype. Following the loss of founding member Syd Barrett in the late 60s, Pink Floyd kind of had to rebuild after a memorable debut album. Around the time of Barrett's departure, they brought in David Gilmour, who would become an integral part of the band, but it did take them a few years to find their sound and direction again. By 1971's Metal, they had really carved their niche with a specific brand of progressive rock that was mixed sometimes with space rock. But by 1973, they really perfected this style, and they started out on a 4-album tear. In episode 1, I mentioned that there can be a difference between perfect albums and no-skip albums. The Dark Side of the Moon is both. It's perfect, and I don't skip anything. Pretty much every track, including the spacey intro Speak to Me and the mechanical On the Run, they're just unbelievable tracks. This whole album is sequenced perfectly. Even the deep cuts are fantastic. The songs Breathe and Time are staples of progressive rock canon. They remain accessible, they show tendencies of space rock and psychedelic rock. The Great Gig in the Sky closes out the A-side with this epic, winding, dramatic piece, just a beautiful end to the first half of the album. The B-side comes in, slaps the listener in the face right away with Money, which is this snarky, cynical piece. Us and Them is a space rock classic. Any Color You Like is a nice late album break. It cleanses the palate before the end of the album build-up, which includes Brain Damage and Eclipse, both of which are among the most iconic Pink Floyd songs of all time. The Dark Side of the Moon goes way beyond these iconic songs, and it's a no-skip album because the deeper cuts are just fantastic. It seems pretty obvious when I say that, but you listen to the full album and you really get the full picture, and there's nothing that should be omitted when you listen to Dark Side of the Moon. The way the album is constructed, the meticulousness with which it was recorded, the band used multi-track loops, synthesizers, things that were unheard of from a technology standpoint at the time. David Gilmour and Roger Waters' songwriting really transcended anything that Pink Floyd had done to that time and pretty much blew every one of their peers out of the water. I would say the only band that maybe held a candle to Pink Floyd's writing style during the time was Genesis. Overall, Dark Side of the Moon, obvious no-skipper for me, easily makes this list. The early 70s were a great time for the emergence of funk music. New Jersey's Funkadelic were one of the leaders of the genre's mass emergence, and while they have a number of great albums from the early 70s, their self-titled effort, Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow, both from 1970. In 1974, standing on the verge of getting it on, my pick from the Funkadelic catalog is 1971's Maggot Brain. This album has some serious sonic diversity. It starts with a beautifully psychedelic and almost morose title track, which has some excellent guitar work from Eddie Hazel. It's a mostly instrumental piece. George Clinton's vocals on this album are not really the main feature. There's a lot of group melodies and harmonies going on here. The next 5 tracks on this album are great psychedelic funk cuts. They're all short, they're pretty accessible. They emphasize the instrumental and musical prowess of the band. There was a ton of musical talent in Funkadelic. Every single song is a banger. Can You Get to That features some folky elements actually, which is a nice touch. Hit It and Quit It brings in some excellent acid funk. Super Stupid is just ridiculously good. Even the deep cuts, You and Your Folks, Me and My Folks, which is a song about interracial love, are fire. The album's nearly 10-minute closer, Wars of Armageddon, features some of the weirdest and most psychedelic moments on the album, as the band plays around with some freaky passages and wild sound effects. A large chunk of Funkadelic Funkadelic left the band for various reasons after Maggot Brain, but the legacy of this album has long been cemented. It's debaucherously funky, it's wildly psychedelic, it's a pretty quick and efficient listen at just 36 minutes. It features a heavy dose of some of the most unique, well-constructed funk. It's bookended by two very different, diverse, long tracks. It offers up just a ton of soulfully funky songs, none of which get skipped when I listen to them. One of my favorite artists from an era that featured a lot of prolific singer-songwriters was Neil Young. Coming out in the late 60s and really honing his craft throughout the 70s, he had some great entries into his discography between 1970 and 1974. 1972's Harvest and 1974's On the Beach were serious candidates for no-skip albums, but for me, I have an inclination towards 1970's After the Gold Rush. While 1969's Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere had Crazy Horse backing Neil Young through the entire album, they only appear on about half the tracks on After the Gold Rush. It featured a mixture of what was becoming Young's patented country folk, with lone wolf tales of lost love and new courtship, and also songs that spoke to real-life issues like the album's centerpiece, Southern Man. Calling out racism and the hypocrisy of Christians in the American South, Southern Man actually triggered Lynyrd Skynyrd to make the song Sweet Home Alabama. But this album, it goes way beyond Southern Man. The opener, Tell Me Why, is one of my favorite moments in his entire catalog. The title track and Only Love Can Break Your Heart are definitely emotionally charged music, but the way that Young pulls it off, it's not too dramatic. Young was perhaps inspired by his crumbling marriage at the time. The entire B-side, it's beautifully constructed and alternates between mellow acoustic pieces and more upbeat country folk leaning songs that keep things fairly upbeat despite some depressing lyrics at times. Even the interludes at the end of each side of the album, Till the Morning Comes and the infectious Cripple Creek Ferry, are just excellent. In my eyes, this is one of Neil Young's finest albums. This got his 70s decade off to an incredible start. This was the beginning of his great run in that decade, and After the Gold Rush is a no-skip album front to back, no questions asked, at least not from me. King Crimson, that's a band with a healthy fan base and a packed discography full of some of the best progressive rock of all time. I feel like the band kind of flew under the radar with how complex their music tended to be. They were basically Pink Floyd on steroids when it came to executing progressive rock. They have some excellent records transcending decades, 60s, 70s, 80s, but perhaps none finer than their 1974 effort, Red. I'll say that I was debating whether or not to include this one. It's only 5 tracks, but the compositions are between 6 and 12 minutes. While it's easy not to skip a track, the entire track for each of the 5 is worth my time at least. King Crimson started their career with a little bit of jazzy influence on albums like In the Court of the Crimson King, their debut. They kept that going on Red, which was released 5 years and a number of albums later, but they got a little bit more technical, they got a little more heavy. The guitar work continued their progressive tendencies. There was also an art rock leaning. The band was a trio at the time, with Robert Fripp serving as the frontman, but he split songwriting duties with bassist John Welton and drummer Bill Bruford. The album starts with the incredible 1-2 punch of the instrumental title track and the song Fallen Angel, which tells the story of gang life gone wrong. One More Red Nightmare, it's an incredibly technical piece, and even the instrumental Providence, which some people might consider a skip, definitely fits into the album's aesthetic and vibe. But the most influential track here is the closer, Starless, one of the greatest songs of all time. The whole band pitched in to write this one. The entire song structure is stunning. Fripp's guitar and mellotron work really steal the show here. And again, King Crimson never really achieved the status of a band like Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, but that shouldn't take away from the fact that they are one of the best progressive rock bands of all time, and Red is probably their magnum opus. For me, it's a no-skipper. The 70s were the decade for David Bowie. He broke out early in the decade with some classics before a drug-addled run in the mid-70s, which led him to head to Berlin, Germany to get as far away from LA as possible, where he knew all his drug dealers and knew how to get high pretty easy. In Germany, he put together the Berlin Trilogy, which is one of the best 3-album runs in music history, but I think his most seminal and iconic work is 1972's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Capitalizing off the glam rock trends that were pretty prominent during the first half of the 70s, Bowie mixes his brand of quirky art rock and accessible kind of piano-driven pop rock here. And on this concept album, Bowie plays the part of this androgynous extraterrestrial rock star known as Ziggy Stardust, who comes to Earth looking for a career as a rock star, looking for acceptance from the masses. The character achieves fame, lets the fame go to his head, and as the album's title suggests, there's a downfall. The way that Bowie tells the story through his lyrics, it's just so clever, it's just so whimsically done. And it's only 38 minutes, but this is kind of an epic rock opera that really tells a lot of story in a little bit of time. From my point of view, this is musically about as well executed as glam rock could ever get. Bands like T-Rex did the style very well, but David Bowie on this album just transcends anything from the glam rock genre. His flamboyant delivery fits very well over this upbeat art rock that, like like I said, is piano-driven at times. There are so many iconic songs on here, from the opener 5 Years to the spacey Moon Age Daydream, the iconic dramatic Starman, the fun and upbeat title track, and the driving Suffragette City. In between these, all of the lesser-known tracks are heat. I actually named the song Star as one of my favorite deep cuts from 70s albums. I'll link that video up in the corner, go check it out. Even the deep cuts play into Bowie's story, so you can't really skip these tracks if you want to be cued in on the story. The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, one of the best albums of all time. One of the best albums of the 70s, one of Bowie's best. This is a no-brainer, no skipper for me. Hands down, my favorite jazz album of the 70s is Miles Davis's Bitches Brew. The 70s were the decade where jazz music started to fall off quite a bit after really achieving its legs in the 50s and 60s. There were still plenty of gems though in the early 70s, and Bitches Brew is a great example. It's an ambitious late career double album where Miles Davis and his backing band explore some really improbable soundscapes. Kind of unheard of in jazz music at the time, but kind of more known in the jazz fusion side of things. They used electric instruments to really give this thing a spacey, futuristic feel. It's only 6 tracks long, but it's also an hour and 34 minutes long, so there's that. The A and B sides are taken up by Pharaoh's Dance and the title track, and Davis and his backing band offer some long, winding passages that are among the most interesting things I've ever heard from any genre, any decade, ever. They're lush, layered, dense, they're extraordinary, honestly. And I'm just fascinated every time I hear this album. Miles runs the voodoo down. One of the album's later cuts is probably my favorite moment off of this album, but you can't go wrong with any track here if you want some superbly executed instrumentation. I'll be honest, I'll say Bitches Brew, it's a challenging listen. It's not one for everyday consumption, I don't think. If you have the patience and if you have an hour and 34 minutes or whatever it is, it really does pay off. The runtime, like I said, it's grueling. Other than the 4-minute John McLaughlin, every song is at least 10 minutes long. The title track comes in at a whopping 27 minutes, so you kind of have to clear some time in your schedule for this one. But when I listen to Bitches Brew, that's what I do. I clear my schedule, I take in the whole thing at once. It's really hard to listen to piecemeal. But when you do make that time, it's a glorious trip. It's a great listen. It's so well crafted. It's astonishingly experimental. I mostly hate long albums, but I really encourage you, when you have a chance, clear your schedule, make 90 minutes for Bitches Brew. It's one of the best jazz and jazz rock, jazz fusion albums in existence. Black Sabbath are one of my favorite bands of all time. I've spent more time listening to Sabbath than pretty much any other band from the era. The first half of the 70s was truly their time. They had 5 albums between 1970 and 1973 that were just on another level. They essentially laid the framework for hard rock and heavy metal into the 70s. They're one of the godfathers of heavy metal. In 1970 alone, they released 2 fantastic albums. Their self-titled effort and Paranoid. 1971's Master of Reality doubles down on the heaviness that they had on their first 2 albums. Volume 4 has some of my favorite moments from the band. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is a clinic on hard rock that mixes in some elements of progressive metal. So remember, I'm only allowed to pick one of these. That's the self-imposed rule here. And while I love their self-titled album and I think it's underrated, it lives in the shadow of Paranoid, the one I have to go with is Paranoid. That's their most iconic album, let's be honest. This was mine and many others' gateway into heavy music. It's so perfect. How could you skip any track on this record, even the instrumental Rat Salad? How? Every song on here is unique and iconic in its own way. The politically driven epic War Pigs, the opener, the heavily shuffling title track, the beautifully serene Planet Caravan, the dystopian, loud Iron Man. Electric Funeral was kind of the birth of doom metal. How about a tale of the horrors of war-induced post-traumatic stress disorder on Hand of Doom? Can't forget about the swingingly heavy Fairies Wear Boots, which is a psychedelic heavy trip to end the album. That's it, I named every track. Nothing gets skipped here. Tony Iommi makes this thing great with his innovative riffing. Ozzy Osbourne's tortured delivery is iconic. Bill Ward, Geezer Butler, they bring up the low end flawlessly on this record. Paranoid is in my top 10 albums of all time. Obviously, it's a no skip for me. I'm ending this with my favorite album by the British progressive rock band Yes. They had some incredible moments in the first 10 years of their career, and the first half of the 70s was a great time for the band, particularly in the 3-album run that includes 1971's The Yes album, 1971's Fragile, and 1972's Close to the Edge. Many people would probably pick Close to the Edge as their no skipper, but that's only 3 tracks long, and I just kind of thought that disqualified it, honestly. So I decided to go with the Yes album, which honestly has a ton of nostalgia for me. So while I love Close to the edge. I will say that my pop used to spin the Yes album all the time. I've Seen All Good People is one of those songs from my childhood that I just love, but listening to it 30 years later as an adult, I just realized how excellent it was. There's a lot of songs from my childhood that I hear all these years later, and it's just like, yeah, that's not that great. No, not the case here. But the album goes way beyond that. Yours Is No Disgrace is a great opener. Starship Trooper is among one of the most iconic prog rock songs of all time, and A Perpetual Change is a very underrated closer. Even the two more interlude type tracks in the middle of each side of the album, The Clap and Adventure, are essential to this album's greatness. Clocking in at about 42 minutes, the Yes album doesn't even think about overstaying its welcome. It hits you with some of the best symphonic prog. Tony Kaye's keyboard parts are just amazing. Steve Howe's guitar work is also on another level. John Anderson's vocals are iconic. This album is just a vibe as a whole. It's perfect. It's a no-skipper album for me. The Yes album. Yes. Time for a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make the cut as no-skip albums for me. You're probably going to think I'm crazy, but when I listen to Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, Holy Holy bothers me. It's a little bit too religious and idealistic. I always thought the song Save the Children also meant well, but again, it just doesn't really sit that well with me. It just seems too optimistic, I guess. Marvin Gaye was extremely passionate and straightforward, which is one of his best qualities, but it actually kind of holds the album back with those two tracks. The rest of the album is perfect, though, let's be honest. Led Zeppelin 4, another album from 1971, is nearly perfect, but you might call me crazy when I say that the song Rock and Roll is overrated, it's overplayed, it's a little bit too much. The way that they mix that upbeat blues rock style, it's just, I don't know, it's cheesy. I just don't really like that song. But if it wasn't for Rock and Roll, I think Going to California is also kind of mid. Curtis from Curtis Mayfield from 1970 almost made it as a no-skipper. His voice alone is almost enough to make this album just perfect. He's so silky smooth on this thing. But the end of the album kind of slows things down a little bit. It kind of loses some of its momentum, especially on the track Wild and Free. It's not a bad cut, it's just not on the same level as the rest of the album. It's okay. And to be a no-skip album, every track has to be better than okay. Stevie Wonder's Intervisions kind of suffers from the same fate as What's Going On. Jesus, Children of America, just too religious, too idealistic for me. These type of songs usually just make me roll my eyes, but ironically, off of Songs in the Key of Life. Have a Talk with God is one that I think is one of the best cuts off of that album. That song, that's just a perfectly funky song though. Jesus Save the Children, not really. Joni Mitchell's Blue is a fantastic album, one of the best regarded albums of all time, but for me, it loses steam on the B-side. This Flight Tonight, The Last Time I Saw Richard, they just don't hold the same standard as the rest of the record. She's a Legend, this is a great record, but I guess that quirky little soprano vocal style just starts to grate on me after about 30 minutes. Gil Scott-Heron's Pieces of a Man is one of the most revolutionary albums of all time, one of the best of the 70s. It's one of my favorite soul records ever. It's pretty much perfect outside of the track, A Sign of the Ages, and while he's really spitting some truth on this track, the vocal jazz style, I don't know, it just sounds a little awkward. It turns me off a little bit. It's not a bad cut by any means, but sometimes I do end up skipping it when I sit down and listen to Pieces of a Man. Finally, Genesis, a prog band that I mentioned earlier that I love, had some incredible, amazing albums in the first half of the 70s. But since I'm picking one album per artist per video, whether it's honorable mentions or otherwise, I'm going to go with Selling England by the Pound here. Fantastic record, but it's weighted down by More Fool Me and After the Ordeal. Those two tracks just kind of lose my interest, I'll be honest. They're shorter, they're less ambitious, and with the song Isle of Plenty right at the end, I just kind of lose my patience a little bit when they come on. All that complex prog and these little folk songs, I don't know, it's a little awkward, and I guess that's a criticism I have across Genesis's catalog. What are the albums that you would listen to from the first half of the 70s and not skip a track? Let me know down in the comments. There's a lot of albums to choose from here. The early 70s, and the whole decade for that matter, was a very, very busy time for music. But tell me about your no-skip albums. Tell me what you think of my picks. We're doing a part 2 of this. As you know, the second half of the 70s have some really good albums. Hint, hint, Asia by Steely Dan. Anyway, thanks as always for tuning in. I appreciate you guys rolling with me. Like and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.